This UCSD TV program is a presentation of University of California Television for educational and non-commercial use only.
I'm Mary Walshock. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor at UCSD, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this opening evening of The Atlantic Meets the Pacific. This is really an exciting new program for this region, and I'd like to believe for the nation. And it is being co-presented this year by UC San Diego and The Atlantic magazine. For many years, a number of us, and many of you are in this room, will remember how we brainstormed how we might create a forum that would draw leadership from across the United States to the San Diego region, not only to enrich our conversations, and that's going to happen for the next two days, but also to make the wonders of this place more visible to media and corporate and foundation leadership around the country. And we'd like to believe that that's another benefit of this event. We found a perfect partner in the Atlantic. I met Elizabeth Keffer, who is the Vice President for Events, and she and I really hit it off in a bar in Washington, D.C. And I was told by a mutual friend, Vivian Warren, who many of you will remember from La Jolla for many, many years, that Elizabeth was the energy behind the very successful Aspen Ideas Festival and Washington Ideas Festival, that it was the partnership between the Atlantic and those two organizations that made things work. And as you can see tonight, that partnership has worked. We really want to thank our underwriters. I don't know, many of you are our guests this evening and friends of friends. And we really are able to do this because of the two major program underwriters we have, Chevron and Merrill Lynch Wealth Management. This program, good. And we have representatives from both companies here throughout the event, and I hope you'll get to know them and tell them how wonderful it was. So we have a terrific roster of journalists and national technology leaders. There'll be lots of good conversation. And we owe a special note of thanks to Pete Ellsworth, who is the CEO of the locally based Benbow Foundation. They're underwriting all of the media coverage. So that's it. Keep eating your salads. But in sum, I am a university person, but there's nothing more wonderful for a community than good conversation and big ideas that we can take home and utilize in our everyday lives as well as in our business and our professional careers. We really believe that the kind of innovation profile that this region has and all of California has merits a more lively conversation with the national media and with national leaders. And that's what The Atlantic Meets the Pacific is about. So I hope you're going to have a very enriching experience, and I welcome you, but I also have the pleasure of introducing a new Californian. I'm already trying to convert his daughter, who's at the University of Florida, to come to UCSD. Joe Holsinger is the managing director of Merrill Lynch Wealth Management, and he's going to add his words of welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Actually, on behalf of Merrill Lynch Wealth Management, I am delighted to be here in California. In spite of this weather, I love the weather and I love the people that I've met here so far. And this event that we have here truly, I think is going to represent a unique experience over the next 2 to 3 days for all of us. We're particularly proud to be associated with The Atlantic, one of the most highly respected, forward-thinking publications in the country. And it's our privilege to be the exclusive financial services underwriter for this inaugural event. As Mary had mentioned, the next few days we are expected to hear in-depth discussions and debates from noted experts where we'll examine innovations and growth opportunities along 3 industries: technology, energy, and healthcare. We'll also have a glimpse into the not-too-distant future, where we'll discover developments that will change the way we and our children live and work in the years to come. We're pleased that Merrill Lynch can serve as an ambassador and a facilitator for such innovative forums. And as we expand on our commitment to providing thought leadership for our clients and for the world, we've launched a website which is focused exclusively on innovation, ml.com/innovation. So in addition to the content from this event, throughout the year we'll feature new insights, perspectives, and research. We'll highlight opportunities of innovation that create opportunity within the economy, as well as for investors. And so I invite you to visit ml.com/innovation frequently in the months and years to come. So on behalf of our firm and of all my colleagues that are here, I want to thank you for being a part of this exclusive event. Wish you a wonderful evening, and I hope you have a great time this week. Thank you very much.
I am Jay Loff. I'm the Vice President and Publisher of The Atlantic, and on behalf of my colleagues and our partners at the University of California, San Diego, welcome to the inaugural The Atlantic Meets the Pacific program. We're delighted to have you with us here. We are privileged tonight to have with us Elon Musk, whose bio I think many of you know, but we'll elaborate that on that in a moment. And to lead the conversation, we're equally delighted to have a man whose career, his own career, really has been as successful and varied as Mr. Musk's in many, many ways. My colleague, Jim Fallows. Many of you in this room probably know. And from that applause, I'll take it that you do know that Jim is one of really the most decorated and respected journalists in America today. He's the national correspondent for The Atlantic. He has been with us, we're grateful to say, for 25 years with The Atlantic, reporting on really a variety of subject matter from world affairs to macroeconomics, politics, and technology. And really from all over the world, in the East and West, at various points along the way for The Atlantic. He's been deployed in Washington, D.C., Berkeley, Austin, Texas, Tokyo, Kuala Lumpur, Shanghai, and most recently and famously maybe Beijing, where up until last year, Jim, or a year and a half ago, for 4 years was reporting back from Beijing, and really I think has elevated himself into the position of a must-read to really understand China's place in the world today. Before The Atlantic, just to give you a little bit of Jim's background, he spent 2 years as the chief White House White House speechwriter for Jimmy Carter. For 2 years after that, as the editor-in-chief of U.S. News and World Report. He squeezed a 6-month stint in there on technology as a program designer for Microsoft, if you will, in between that. Right, exactly. So obviously a vast and varied career before joining us. He is the current chairman and has been since 1999 of the board for the New America Foundation. Jim has been nominated for 5 National Magazine Awards, which is the Oscars of our industry. He has won one of those. He's won an American Book Award for nonfiction, and the list goes on. And in his copious spare time, he's also an instrument-rated pilot. So I have a feeling he shares with our conversation partner today a love of things that fly and move fast, and maybe you'll explore that. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Jim. Thank you, Jim.
The theme we're going to explore in the next 2+ days involves confluence of various kinds, of science, of pure science and technology, and commerce and innovation and public policy and the human condition and culture and all the rest. And we have a gentleman to lead this off who epitomizes in the spectacular and so far brief career he's had a variety of different interests that he's been able to meld, and maybe we'll hear there's a unified field theory behind it, but at least we'll have different ones. I'm going to take a minute to read a few of Elon Musk's achievements just as background for the kind of variety and breadth that he brings to this conversation. He's now the CEO and product architect of Tesla Motors, and also the CEO, CTO of Space Exploration Technologies, SpaceX, which had, of course, its wonderful launch a little more, when was that, 2 years ago? When it was a year?
The Falcon 9?
Falcon 9 is what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, Falcon 9, we did 2 launches last year, yeah.
And it was in recognition of the Falcon 9 that I served as Mr. Musk's mini biographer a year ago. We had our annual Brave Thinkers issue for The Atlantic, so I got to do a brief Q&A with you about all the various things. You're also the non-executive chairman and principal shareholder of Solar City, which is now the leading provider of solar power systems in the U.S. And of course, among other things, in your spare time, you were the co-founder of PayPal. I will just give 1 or 2 other accolades and then get on to the conversation. That in 2009, the National Space Society awarded our guest, Mr. Musk, their Von Braun Trophy, given for leadership of the most significant achievement in space. And in 2010, he was the youngest recipient of the Auto Executive of the Year Innovator Award for his work at Tesla Motors. And so, and we'll have one more, and then we'll get to actual questions, which is there are other publications in the universe apart from the Atlantic Monthly. One of them is Time. It's a younger publication than we are. They're about 80 years old. We're 154 and counting. But the Time 100 for 2010, you were a member of that. So with that background, we have a few minutes to explore a whole variety of topics about the business histories of the various enterprises you've been involved in, about the frontiers of energy and transportation and the sky and the land, about the process of innovation, the U.S. environment for making these discoveries. But let me just start. Most of us are wondering how you could possibly have been involved in so many different fields and be pushing the frontiers of all of them. How did you end up being in PayPal and space exploration and solar power and all the rest? How did you get here?
Sure. Well, some of that was serial. So I did an internet company that most people haven't heard of called Zip2, which helped bring the newspapers online. The newspapers weren't always online, but my company helped bring helped with the New York Times and Hearst and Night Road and a few other things, and then with the capital from that, I started PayPal, which was originally called X.com, and then from the capital of that, it allowed me to start SpaceX, Tesla, and Solar City. And I didn't expect to be running SpaceX and Tesla, but I kind of had the choice of either let Tesla die or run it personally, and so I didn't want to let it die. So I stepped in and ran personally, but I have to say it's quite difficult running 2 companies at the same time. I don't want to make it sound like this is easy. It's really difficult.
And was it planned all along that you would get into this whole range of fields, or was that opportunistic,
actually,
as it turned out?
No, it was actually, well, planned is maybe aspirational. So when I was in college, there were 3 areas that I thought would most affect the future of humanity in a positive way, but I thought of these in the abstract, not from the standpoint I would actually be able to be involved in those 3 areas. But those were the internet, sustainable energy, both production and consumption. Tesla's about production. Solar City is about production. Tesla's about consumption of energy in a sustainable way. And then the third is making life multiplanetary. I really didn't think I'd be involved in the third one. But it did seem to me that's one of the really important things that should happen if we're to have an exciting and inspiring future.
And you said something which caught my attention, that when you were in college and developing these skills, you wanted to do some things that were of benefit to humanity. Why did you think that?
Well,
because not everyone does.
Yeah, no, I guess it was, I had sort of a existential crisis of like, what does it all mean, and what's the meaning, what's the meaning of life, and
Was this 3 a.m. over a beer, or this was more serious than
probably goes back to high school, I guess. I don't want to give a laboriously long answer, but I was, I had sort of a dark childhood. It wasn't good. Probably partially brought on by reading some of the philosophers. Like, don't ever read Schopenhauer and Nietzsche if you're 14. It's not good.
Yeah, or Ayn Rand either.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was just trying to figure out what does it all mean. And actually, when I read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I think is a great work of philosophy, that sort of highlighted the point that very often the issue is understanding what questions to ask. And if you can properly frame the question, then the answer is the easy part. So I thought things that expand the scope and scale of the human consciousness and allow us to better ask questions and achieve greater enlightenment, those were good things. And so that's sort of what can we do that's going to most likely lead to that outcome. And so obviously we have to, the internet is an important element to that, because the internet is like, it's like the world acquiring a nervous system. All of a sudden, you can be anywhere. If you have an internet connection, you have access to the cumulative knowledge of humanity. It's pretty incredible. I mean, you have more access to more information than the Library of Congress through your iPhone. I want to be part of, put a small brick in the construction of that edifice. And that's why the internet, and then sustainable energy, because, well, tautologically, if it's not sustainable, we're going to hit a wall. Even if one considers the environmental issues to be non-existent, in fact, you could say, for the sake of argument, that CO2 is beneficial. Let's assume it's beneficial. By the way, I think that would be a bad assumption. All respect to Chevron. And then even if you assume that the United States has every drop of oil in the world, well, we still need to get off oil eventually, because what will happen is that scarcity will drive the price up, leading to economic collapse. And so my interest in electric vehicles goes back to college, before global warming became a real issue. But I think the environmental issues do add additional urgency to the matter. It's simply unwise to run an experiment on how much CO2 the ocean's atmosphere can absorb.
Yes, yes. Let me ask one other question about, again, you and how you got to this point in life. One reason people read biographies of accomplished people is to get more clues, more data points on how it happened, what the steps were along the road. Many people come out of college and can't find a job. You've invented several entire new industries or companies. What do you think made you the way you are, and what can be extrapolated? Could other people learn from your example to date?
I think I need to sort of put some thought into that and say what lessons can be drawn, because I'm so usually in the thick of things that I haven't really put a lot of time into abstracting what lessons can be most helpful. But the way I tend to view problems is from a physics standpoint. I think physics is a good analytical framework, and one of the key things in physics is to reason from first principles. This is contrary to the way most human reasoning takes place, which is by analogy. Reasoning from first principles just means that you figure out what are the fundamental truths or things that people are pretty sure are fundamental truths, and can you build up to a conclusion from that, from those principles, and then certainly if you come up with some idea and it appears to violate one of those fundamental truths, then you're probably wrong, or you should get a really big prize or something like that. This may seem like, I don't know, it may seem sort of obvious when it's explained, but it's actually not what people do. Reasoning by analogies is helpful because it's a shortcut.
Yeah.
And it's mostly correct, but it tends to be most incorrect when you're dealing with new things. because it's hard to analogize to something really new.
Let me now shift to the areas where your businesses are now operating. You have a solar power company, obviously. You have the electric cars, and you have space. And so let's talk about each of those areas. Give us, if you would, what you think the potential of solar power is, and you were making your point about the importance of addressing sustainability and energy. How you think people should think about energy now, about solar energy and more broadly?
Sure. Well, I think solar power will be the single biggest source of electricity, at least in the United States, by the midpoint of the century. And that may seem like a bold statement given the tiny percentage that it generates right now, which is on the order of sort of 1%, or less than 1% really. But if you look at the growth rate of solar, that's where it's gonna go. This compound growth is incredibly powerful. But I think anything we can do to accelerate that growth is a good thing, because it means we'll have power as long as the sun shines. And if the sun doesn't shine, we have larger issues. So I think that's a good way to go. And actually, the Earth is almost entirely solar powered today. The only reason we're not a frozen ice ball at around 4 Kelvin, maybe 3 Kelvin, is because of the sun. And so all the precipitation, the weather system, almost everything is solar powered. The ecosystem is solar powered. So it's really just about taking a little bit of that solar power and turning that into electricity, which people could use.
And is there a way to explain concisely, in terms I might understand, the concept that Solar Cities is applying that will make it successful in a way that previous solar projects have not been?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I should say that most people don't realize how much the cost of solar panels has dropped. They used to be about $4 a watt 5 years ago. They're now about $1.20. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge drop. And there's obviously this sort of threshold where when solar power is cheaper than conventional electricity, that's a massive inflection point. And electricity costs vary across the country. So you'll see it starts to be better in some places, then a small number of places, then a medium, then eventually most places, right? Which I think is what will occur. And I'm not saying solar power will be everything, but I think it'll probably be at least a plurality, maybe a majority by the midpoint of the century. And most of what Solar City specifically is focused on is actually balance of system. Solar City does not make the panel. Solar City is it's kind of like, say, Apple or Dell, where they design the system appropriate to a particular house or office, and they'll do the installation, wiring, the inverter, permitting, and after-sales service, which is about 70% of the cost.
And since I've come from DC only today, where any discussion of solar involves Solyndra scandal, right, government policy, yeah, et cetera, what should the government be doing, if anything, about solar now?
Yeah, well, I think the Solyndra thing is somewhat overblown. It's also become political football, but not a very good one. I think Republicans should pick up, and I'm sort of moderate, sort of half Republican, half Democrat, if you will, but. I'm somewhere in the middle. I guess I'm sort of socially liberal and fiscally conservative, which I think a lot of the country is, actually. Yeah. But the thing is that if you look at Solyndra, the specific case Solyndra, private investors lost twice as much as the government, mm-hmm, and the investors, the venture capitalists that were involved in Solyndra are some of the smartest venture capitalists out there. They're not fools. So it's difficult to say the government was a fool if you've got some of the best venture capitalists in there investing in it all. It's just startups it's a bit of a numbers game, you know. Right. Typically in Silicon Valley, venture capitalists, if they invest in 20 companies, 1 or 2 will be a big hit, maybe 3 or 4 will be okay, and the rest will not make it. But that's the way it works. I don't think it makes sense for the media to be so focused on Solyndra. There will be other failures too, by the way.
Yes.
It's not,
right.
Yeah.
And is there anything briefly that the government is doing right now that is either helping or hindering your work at Solar City?
Well, probably both, I suppose. but I think probably on balance more helpful than hurtful. And certainly, in the case of SpaceX, a lot of credit goes to NASA, where, I mean, SpaceX wouldn't have been able to get started, and nor would it have gotten to where it is today without the help of NASA.
Right.
So this is very much a sort of a partnership on that front. And then with Solar City, the Solar City actually doesn't gets a little bit on the federal side and a little bit in certain states in terms of subsidies for solar. But those subsidies are actually relatively small these days. They're not very big. They used to be big, but then they've been declining every year. And the big challenge for Solar City is, of course, to provide unsubsidized power at better than grid costs. That's sort of the holy grail there. And then, of course, Tesla has received a loan from the government. Which is part of why I get these Solyndra questions. But actually, Solar City, Tesla has also raised about twice as much from the private sector as from the government. And if Tesla is to compete effectively against GM, Ford, Chrysler, and others, and those guys are getting massive amounts of money from the government and at near zero cost of capital, and we don't participate in that game, it makes a very difficult job even harder. And so it would be sort of really unwise if we didn't do that.
And let's talk now about the electric car business itself. What should people expect in terms of the technological improvements that are ahead, of how much of a difference this will make in energy consumption and environmental impact, in patterns of life? How should we think about this?
Well, actually, on electric cars, I actually think that electric vehicles will be, a majority of all new cars manufactured in about 20 years will be pure electric. And 20 years after that, I expect the vast majority of cars on the road to be pure electric. It takes sort of at least sort of 15 years-ish to replace the existing fleet. So that's another prediction. Hopefully I live to see the truth or falseness of that. But in terms of how I think it'll affect things, I think the transportation experience will become better. And most people haven't driven an electric car or used one day to day. But it's actually really nice not having to go to a gas station. Sorry, Chevron. Sorry. I don't mean to.
They are diversifying too as time goes on.
Absolutely. I know Chevron's doing a lot of good things. So I don't mean to be negative on that front. So I think with the Model S in particular, that's coming out in July of next year. That's where we hope to show that an electric car can actually be superior to a gasoline car in terms of how much usable space you get in the car. So the Model S is about the same external dimensions as, say, a Mercedes E-Class or BMW 5 Series, but it has twice the luggage capacity. And it can actually seat up to 5 adults plus two kids in a rear-facing seat, kind of like the old station wagons. And it'll have a range of over 300 miles. You can charge it in about 45 minutes. You can swap the battery pack out faster than you can fill a gas tank. And it'll have the highest safety rating of any car in the world. It'll be 5-star in every category. And in fact, it'll be the only car that's 5-star in every category by 2012 standards. So it'll be the safest car you could buy.
And its cost would be order of magnitude what?
Well, look, it's $1 to $2 million. So it's a great deal. But for you, no, it's actually priced at the same price as other premium sedans. So it's about $50,000 starting price, and then it goes up to about $100,000 for the high performance version with all the options. And actually, when you factor in that gasoline is much more expensive than electricity per mile, it's about 10 times more expensive. When you factor in those cost savings, it's almost like anywhere from a $10,000 to $20,000 discount off the price.
And so one other question on electric cars, is the challenge between now and the future you're describing mainly an engineering challenge, or is there a science challenge that's still left?
I think it's mostly an engineering challenge. There's some there is a science challenge potentially in the high energy density capacitors. And in fact, what originally brought me out to California was I was going to do grad studies at Stanford to try to develop a high energy density capacitor that could serve as an energy storage mechanism in electric vehicles. I think, now I wasn't sure that success was one of the possible outcomes, but now I'm increasingly convinced that it could work, and there's definitely some interesting science there. So.
So I'm going to ask you a question about space and then a question about American policy before I invite a few questions from the crowd. A question on space. For Americans of my vintage, which is tragically older than your vintage, space was very romantic in the time when I was a kid and we were having the race to the moon, and it's become routine, and you don't find children seemingly excited in space. Why are you fascinated with space? Why should people care about it?
Right. Well, I think part of the problem, the reason people aren't as excited about space is that we haven't been pushing the frontier as much. And so you can only watch the same movie so many times before it gets a little boring. And in the 60s and early 70s, we were really pushing the frontier of human spaceflight. And obviously those landing on the moon is regarded as one of the greatest achievements of humanity, of arguably of life itself. And even though only a handful of people went to the moon, vicariously we all went there. Well, at least I wasn't alive at the time, but retrospectively. And it was just one of those really inspiring things that I think made everyone glad to be, human. It's like the things that they're bad things humanity does, and they're good things, and this is one of the good things. And I do think it's important that we have these inspiring things that make you glad to get up in the morning and glad to be a member of the human race. And we need to push that frontier. And I think the great goal we should be trying to pursue is trying to make life make life multiplanetary. Mm-hmm. So to establish a self-sustaining and growing civilization on another planet, Mars being the only realistic possibility, and I think that would just be one of the greatest things humanity could ever try to do. Life's been on Earth for 4 billion years, yeah. And it's been confined to Earth for 4 billion years, and so I think most people want a future where we're headed towards being a spacefaring civilization. We're going out there exploring the stars, and we want to be on a path to making true the things that we read in science fiction books and see in the movies, and that's an exciting future. But a future where we are forever confined to Earth until some eventual extinction event is less inspiring.
You should be a journalist. This is how all our stories turn out. And how much of this, if the space part of your visions and collective visions goes as well as you expect, how much do you expect actually to see yourself? Setting aside any life extension experiments you may come up with, but right. What do you think is feasible in the next half century, in the next century?
Well, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves with SpaceX, but I think we could potentially send someone to Mars as soon as 10 years, and I'd be disappointed if it took us longer than 20. But then going beyond that, what's important is not to sort of have a flags and footprints mission, but to develop the technologies that could allow people to move to Mars if they wanted to. And I think that threshold number for where it would become kind of a self-sustaining reaction is around $500,000. So that's really the key question. Can you get it down to where the cost of moving to Mars plus enough to get going is equivalent to a middle-class house in California? Yeah. Because then you can sell your stuff and move, right? And then, okay.
That's how people came here to start with, yeah.
Right.
That's true how my parents came here.
I think that's possible. I wasn't sure it was possible. In fact, I'm still not 100% sure it's possible, but but I now think it is possible. I have basic architecture and design in mind that I think could accomplish that. Yeah. in that time frame.
I have one more question to ask you, and then I'll turn it over for questions from the crowd. You've given us now almost half an hour of really inspiring and encouraging things to think about, that most of our power will come in from these solar installations, that most of the cars will be running for a tenth the mile cost per mile, that will be going to Mars in 10 or 20 years.
Yeah.
You must have noted that the prevailing mood in the U.S. right now is not quite that
I know people are
encouraged.
too negative, really. It's like people should lighten up a little, I think, honestly.
And so, I mean, one. But it's my duty, of course, to press on the scab of optimism, or the scab of pessimism, which is that for example,
Scab of optimism, geez.
How about the festering sore of pessimism? Okay. I can say that many of the fundamentals that have made Americans successful in research over the years seem to be less invested in now than in the future. We still have people coming from around the world like you to make this the arena for their talents, which is America's greatest asset in my view, but universities are having troubles, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think on the objective merits, how do you think about America's position right now as an arena for the kind of innovation you're discussing?
Sure. Well, actually, I should mention my grandfather was American, and I was named after my great-grandfather, who was from Minnesota. That's where my name comes from. It's not at all exotic. So I'm really returning to my ancestral homeland by coming back to the U.S. Yeah, I mean, I think that I think there are actually lots of reasons to be optimistic, and that life is actually pretty good, But and if I may criticize the media a little bit here. And actually, not so much the magazine media. I think magazine media is actually pretty good. But
good
I think
choice.
The daily news media tends to focus on the worst thing occurring in the world at any given point. It is like if the world. There's almost 7 billion people or something like that on Earth. You can imagine that the 7 billion thing is pretty awful. Okay, it's really bad. If you look at your Google News page or whatever it is, you'll see a spotlight on the worst thing on Earth. It should be called "What is the worst thing on Earth today?" That's it is.
Yes.
It's terrible. No, I think it's. I mean, daily news media is probably to blame, but I think also there's something in the psyche of the human psyche which tends to place a weight on negative stuff more than positive. I mean, you want to react faster to the lion that's going to eat you rather than dinner's on the table. Yeah. Being dinner is going to get worse than having dinner. So even though that the news that you're reading is probably doesn't affect you directly, and it's somewhere else in the world, it still has that sort of negative visceral reaction. I know I'm not quite sure how that problem gets solved, but I do think the mood ought to improve because it's out of sync with the reality. Life is really pretty good.
You've made a good case for that now. We have time for a couple questions. I'm going to turn to Mary for the responsibility to choose questioners. Yeah, you got to choose, yes, among your friends and colleagues here.
Elon, if I might ask you, you guys are talking pretty lightheartedly about things are actually pretty good, but I think it's fair to say everyone in the room is aware that a lot of people, many of those billions of people, they don't have proper food, they don't have proper shelter, they don't have proper clothing, they don't get educated around the world. And, we're talking rather glibly about perhaps making interplanetary journeys to the moon or the Mars. I'm just wondering, well, how about taking some of this, effort and really trying to devote it to solving these very intractable problems here on Earth before we worry about going to the moon or going to Mars?
Well, I don't think it's an either-or thing, and I should maybe clarify that in terms of making life multiplanetary, which you can sort of view as kind of life insurance for life collectively. I think we should spend a lot. Say much less than we would spend on healthcare, but more than we spend on lipstick. That's kind of like maybe a good way to bracket it. And so maybe, and I like lipstick, but maybe 0.25% of the GDP. So it's not, I think that's maybe a good number. Now, I mean, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, I think, I mean, in fact, there was a good, I think Fire News, well, actually, I read an article recently, I can't remember who wrote it, but it was called A History of Violence. And that, we're actually at this incredibly non-violent period in history. So if one of the metrics you'll use is like, how much violence is there in the world? We're at this ridiculously low violence period. The probability of someone in the world dying from war or some violent event is extremely low, and the lowest it's ever been in history. That's a reason to be positive. And if you look at most countries in the world that we used to consider to be, I guess, poor, I mean, like, say, in India or China, they've made massive strides. That's, I suppose, a good and a bad thing. It's good, obviously primarily good, but it also means that there are a lot more resources that get used. China is now putting more new cars on the road than the U.S. is. But still, it's a good thing overall. So I wouldn't think of the rest of the world as not improving. I think it is improving. One may be unhappy with the rate of improvement, but it certainly is. It is improving. There's still issues in lots of parts of the world, but they're going in the right direction. They're not getting worse, except in a few exceptional cases. And where those are exceptional cases, they tend to be more driven by corrupt government or civil war than technology problems. So, but it's sort of unfashionable these days to sort of go and take out some, well, I guess maybe it's not that unfashionable, to take out dictators of other countries. And so I'm not sure what I could do, in that thing. It's like I don't think these are technology problems for them,
And to clarify one thing you said that I think should be clarified, you're a person with great success in life, and you're not saying, oh, life is good for me. You're arguing that life is better for
precisely.
most people than we usually appreciate.
Better for the vast majority of people in the world. I mean, it's difficult to bat 1,000 on everywhere all the time, but the vast majority of people in the world, life is good. Exactly. I'm not. Life is great for me.
Mary, yes. Yes.
Hi, Elon. So I had the opportunity to tour your factory, which is brand new and amazing. And I noticed that while your cars are battery driven, and that's great, it's also that the entire frame of the car is made of aluminum.
Correct.
And I was wondering how you made that choice, and maybe should we build all cars with an aluminum frame?
I mean, I think aluminum is the best choice of material because with the Model S, we wanted to achieve an extremely high safety rating, but not make the car super heavy. Because then, if it's so the problem with if you use steel is that it ends up being you can either make it heavy and safe or light and unsafe, like either of those alternatives, and so hence the use of aluminum. It is a little harder to work with aluminum. It's harder to join and so forth. But since in the aerospace industry, people would not make a plane out of steel. I mean that would be a bit silly.
Or not a plane that would fly.
Right. Steel would also not be the first choice for a rocket. Although I should point out the early Atlas tanks were steel balloons. But for the most part, you would not make a rocket out of steel. So I do think moving to aluminum would generally be a good idea.
I was actually presenting some work I did at a conference at Stanford, and NASA actually saw what I was doing. They asked me to come over to the Ames Center. They brought me over there and they tasked me on a project to build a genome synthesizer for Mars, which is kind of a crazy story. So I just moved here to La Jolla and actually started a company called Cambrian Genomics.
Okay.
Where actually a couple days ago I met with Craig Venter and the entire team there. Originally they contacted me in Korea, and it's part of why I dropped out of school to come here and start this company and work with Craig.
All right.
Right. So Craig, he made the first synthetic cell, right, from completely synthetic DNA, right. So the company I started is called Cambrian. It was started with George Church at Harvard. Both of us came up with these light-based devices to get DNA off a next-gen sequencer, right? So the synthesis that we do is massively parallel. The sequencing we do is massively parallel. And then we use laser as a serial capture process. We can capture about 100 base pairs every second, 2 seconds.
And can you steer this towards a question towards him? Yeah.
Anyway, so my thinking was basically that people weren't very interested in going to Mars for the simple reason that it's a bunch of red rocks. It doesn't look very interesting, and they've seen lots of pictures of it on the television.
Well, it's definitely a fixer-upper of a planet. I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Right. So if we could go there, potentially do something interesting, and have people do, make interesting things for the planet and terraform maybe small parts of it, we could do something maybe a little bit more interesting. Do you have any plans? I know your original plans were to do the greenhouses, but maybe we could do it without the greenhouses, right?
Well, I think long term it's possible to terraform Mars and make it much like Earth. But that's sort of a long-term project that may take a few centuries. But in the meantime, we need to have established cities on Mars, and I think that would require sort of domes and that kind of thing. But that's the only way to go, I think. And then over time, we can terraform it, and then I think there could be a role for specially designed microbes in that scenario. It's tough right now for Mars because it's quite cold and well, it's not super cold. I mean, there are times at Mars where it gets above freezing, but you don't have the same UV protection that you have on Earth, or the same cosmic ray protection. So you kind of need to fix a few things about the planet, I think, before it's really going to be feasible to have microbes that could live outdoors on Mars.
So the kindly Mary has said that we should have a few more questions from her. Yes, so if you are willing.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Evan Williams and Amory Lovins right up here in the front. I'm just curious if either of them wants to enter into this conversation.
I want to pay tribute to something that Tesla that I think has some important implications. Your chief engineer, J.B. Straubel, is an old and dear friend of mine.
Yeah.
And the original Roadster had a problem that the gearbox blew up when it tried to meet the acceleration and speed specs simultaneously. So JB had the neat idea of getting rid of the gearbox, getting more power out of the motor. And his colleagues said, well, then the motor will overheat. We'll have to Band-Aid on this Baroque cooling system. So he said, no, we'll figure out what's getting hot, and we'll give it a bigger cross-section or a higher conductivity, and we'll tweak the software and power electronics to match. And correct me on this, but I think the result was something like no gearbox, 10 miles longer range, 14 pounds lighter weight, less noise, less maintenance, much lower manufacturing cost. Everything got better. So the moral of that story was that there's a lot more flexibility in the software and power electronics design space than in the Baroque Victorian mechanical arts, and that the ability to exploit that flexibility probably goes more to the small agile company than the big rich company. Now, you may like to know that when I told this story to the chief engineer of one of the big automakers who had been saying electric traction will never make it in the market, internal combustion engines will rule for another half century, within a few weeks, he gave an interview in the trade press saying he changed his mind and now he thought the future of traction was electric.
Okay, great.
And I think this is a very interesting example of the kind of mind-bending that goes on in the kinds of small entrepreneurial outfits that you have started. And, you know, the search for intelligent life on Earth continues, but some really promising specimens are turning up just when and where we need them. Thank you.
So I think we have a microphone way in the back. Yeah.
So you've had a remarkable entrepreneurial journey, and my question is just, where do you draw the bounds on your entrepreneurial vision? Do you, for instance, see yourself as, if you get someone to Mars, are you going to be its first real estate developer, for instance?
Well, I think SpaceX is going to be focused on the problem of being able to transport large numbers of people and cargo to Mars at an affordable, at low cost, very reliably. Kind of like the the Union Pacific sort of, but then I think that will enable a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs en masse. But we're still, if we can enable all sorts of opportunities there, then I would count that very successful. So we'll just do the things that other people don't want to do. But I think step one is getting there, and if you can't get there, then it doesn't matter. I mean, if people couldn't get across the Atlantic, there would be no United States. So.
Before we thank Elon Musk, which we all will do enthusiastically, we'll have a minute of stage visit. We want to thank Merrill Lynch. We want to thank Chevron also for its patience and big-heartedness in this session in particular. We want to thank UCSD. We want to thank the Atlantic's event staff. So now please join me in thanking Elon Musk.